So, if you take the people out, then you end up with all this factual information that has accumulated over the centuries now. And, you know, it takes a long time to learn all of the facts so that you can then finally, when you're close to 30, you can apply it if you really want to go on a scientific career. And so we lose the kids, and we've made it so hard and so difficult and so arcane that it's probably going to die out. We'll never have science again. I wanted to say a few words about immunology as a discipline, and because it's another example of this whole thing. Immunology historically has really only come into being as a real science in the last 30 or 40 years, since 1980. And consequently, there aren't any classes in immunology in school. You don't learn it. You didn't really. I don't know what's going on now in primary and secondary school, but I know when I grew up, I had no classes. Even in medical school, they didn't have a class in immunology when I went through it in the 60s, because it really hadn't been developed yet. There really wasn't a discipline, and either in science or in medicine in immunology. And nowadays, you don't get it in high school that I know about. And in college, if you go, I went to a small liberal arts college. I went to one of those egalitarian humanist kinds of things. The school was started by the Baptists, and so it was going to make me a good Christian. And that failed totally. So I was a confirmed atheist before I started. But anyway, we didn't even get close to that. So in college, you had biology, you had inorganic chemistry, you had organic chemistry, and you had physics. That was it. And you didn't really, there weren't any courses offered in immunology until graduate school or medical school. And that's only been in the last 30, 40 years. And so in our country, most people, even the science, unless you go to graduate school or medical school today, you don't have a clue about immunology. And most of the doctors don't. And that's very evident to me, for example, in this COVID-19 crisis now, because the infectious disease docs are the ones that are taking care of these patients. But the symptoms, the signs and the symptoms of the infection are not due to the virus. They're due to the immune response to the virus. They're the inflammatory symptoms that the immune system this is a huge battle going on in the body. And so I've been trying to convince anybody who will listen to me that when you need to know immunology and you need to know how to block these different kinds of molecules, because they're going bonkers. And but the ID people, the infectious disease people, the only thing they know how to do is give drugs to kill the bugs. If they can't do that, they just throw up their hands. And that's what's going on in the treatment of these patients. The infectious disease people are sort of in charge. And when the lungs start to fill up with fluid because of the inflammation in the lungs, they put them on respirators and just give them supportive care. And that's the only thing they know how to do. So we don't have a tradition of education in immunology in our country. And I've always been jealous of the Australians, because there was not in the early days, but in this last century, there was an Australian who became one of the world's famous immunologists, and his name was Macfarlane Burnet from Melbourne. And he was evidently quite the man. And I've talked to people who knew him. He's subsequently passed on. And they said he had such an ego. I mean, he figured that if he didn't know about it or invent it, then it probably wasn't very important, you know. and, but he ultimately became, after he became established and so forth, he became the director of a research institute in Melbourne. It was called the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And he educated then a whole generation of scientists that came out of the WEHI, is what we call it. And a lot of them became famous. And that was sort of just before me, or also in my generation. And they started teaching, so they became, a lot of them, Burnett was a rock star, and a lot of them became rock stars so that they became household names. And the kids started learning about this stuff in their grade schools and in their high schools. And now they've codified it, and so they have. And I've talked to some of my Australian friends, and they say, "Oh, you know, we start teaching these kids in grade school," and they think the immunologists are gods down there. So, and that's in contrast to what we're doing up here. We don't even tell them about it until they're almost middle-aged, and so. And I guess that's really the final subject of the whole thing. What can we do to try to popularize science in our country in the same way I've always felt if you weren't, and when you're growing up, and they ask all the little boys, what do you want to be when you grow up? When it used to be you wanted to be a fireman or a policeman, but nowadays it's an athlete, it's a performing artist, it's a politician, it's a successful business person. That's it. There isn't anything else to do. And they don't even know you can become a scientist, or a working scientist that actually does experiments and so forth. And so that's what we're up against. What we need to do is in grade school, we need to be teaching the scientific method. Now, and I think they're doing that more today. In other words, in the first, second, third grade, the kids do little experiments. They learn the scientific method, and that goes back to what we were talking about, that I was talking about when we started. You can't just use deductive reasoning. The way to attract the younger generation is to teach the scientific method and to start doing experiments in grade school. And then, as you get older and the students learn more and more things, and you can have it in all the different disciplines, in biology and in chemistry and physics and all kinds of things. You can do experiments so that they just, by osmosis, they learn what the scientific method is, which is taking whatever observations there are about a particular problem or happening, and you collect all the information, all the observations, and then on the basis of what you know, then you formulate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is not a question, it's a statement, and the statement is the most plausible explanation of the phenomenon based on all the observations. But it's not just a plausible explanation in and of itself, it has to be a testable explanation. Is it this or is it that? And because the next stage in the scientific method is actually formulating an experiment that will answer the question, is it this or is it that? Testing the hypothesis. And if you find out it's that, then you can formulate a new hypothesis to go on to the next step, and then the next step, and the next step. One of my humanist friends recently told me that they didn't care anything about science. It's always changing. so what are you going to do about that? I'll have to say. So if you do that, then at the same time that the kids are doing little experiments, you give them the history of the discipline, whatever it is, and you tell them, you have them read the biographies of the famous scientists in this particular business, like Louis Pasteur or whoever, and then you have a seminar. You talk about them. What do you think? Why was this guy so good, and so forth. And so they start to learn about the people that are scientists, and why they were successful, and how the system works, how you gain new knowledge. That's what it's all about. It's gaining new knowledge that nobody else knows about. And that's when the creative process comes into the whole thing, because it's extremely creative, because you're creating new knowledge that nobody knows. And that's about as creative as you can get, as far as I can see. And so it's a wonderful experience. Once you find out a new good answer, you get a mind rush, as one of my sons told me. And so it's really exhilarating, is what happens to you. And so if you can instill that in the little kids, and then the older ones as they're coming along, and that's what we all need to do. And I think, just personally, that our whole country needs to, so that we don't have this cult of ignorance in the United States. And so I'll stop there and end my discourse on the whole thing.